welcome back. You're watching the special budget edition of The Firm. We're asking the question whether Budget 2013 did enough to attract foreign investment. And in this part of the conversation, I want to take up the negative tax proposals. The first one being the most contentious one, the finance bill saying that tax residency certificates are necessary but not sufficient to avail of tax treaty benefits. Now, the fact that this found no mention in the finance minister's speech and that it was a retroactive amendment made it highly reminiscent of Budget 2012. But to be fair, since then there have been prompt clarifications. The finance ministry saying that Circular 789 of 2000 will stand and that Mauritius-based investors do not need to be worried. Rohan, are you satisfied with what you've heard in terms of clarifications from the finance minister?
Firstly, I think credit for the fact that, once they understood the sensitivity.
That's just so unfair. Are you trying to say they don't understand their own budget document?
The situation is, I don't think sometimes you can completely anticipate the intensity of what something will do.
How can you not anticipate in this environment when you say a TRC is necessary but not sufficient, that there won't be a big pushback to it?
So the situation is, they had it earlier. At that stage, they got no real adverse comment on it. Now that they sort of brought it center stage, they did. So all I'm saying is, they could have waited and sat on this, but they've come through and said, look, we're going to correct it. Even yesterday he said thrice, I'll explain my explanation. Having said which, if you see that particular clause, if he is on this basis to say that the TRC now is restored the position that it had under Circular 789, and as that was interpreted by the Supreme Court in Azadi Bachao, then TRC is definitive and you need to see nothing more. If that is what he now intends, then really that clause has no significance.
But it has to be removed from the finance bill, right?
So
just a clarification is of no help.
It has to be withdrawn and struck off, rather than saying I'll find a way to deal with it. Because if you intend now to say that the TRC is definitive and I will look no further, then all you have to say is I will withdraw that provision. I don't think as yet we've heard anyone say that we are withdrawing this provision.
Well, I think they've said things to the effect that we will change the finance bill. But I'm not sure. I mean, I guess the test of their intention will be to see if that really does happen, right? How difficult can it be to withdraw that clause?
But now that you have such an escalated crisis on this issue, you will not appease people till you do not actually withdraw it.
Yeah.
Because if you still leave something in play, people will always be skeptical and suspicious. So I think now the greater the onus that he takes a definitive step and just kills the issue.
Okay, Rohan is giving them brownie points for having at least reacted to the reactions that, this TRC issue brought up. I'm not feeling that charitable. I can't for the life of me understand why they would throw something like this out at a time when they know that the slightest change in tax is going to sort of yield, outsized reactions.
Ambiguity of any form, in any manner whatsoever, is something investors detest. So you need clarity. So long as there is clarity, if people know what the tax regime is, they are fine. But once you bring in ambiguity in any tax law, then it creates its own degree of problems, its own series of problems.
I'm wondering if you were fielding calls from clients wondering what in heavens is happening.
No, absolutely. And I mean, as we know that in a budget exercise there's so many pulls and tugs all around, so there must have been a segment that wanted to have a go at it, but when they saw the reaction, I think they backed off.
Yeah, and I think it hurts even more because this whole Mauritius route is...
I don't buy this don't understand theory.
You don't, right?
No,
yeah, I don't buy it either. I'm not feeling that charitable about it. I'm happy that they've claimed that they will clarify it and take it out, but I guess that will be tested. They did two other things, specifically on the tax front, that is negative to multinational corporations and some kinds of foreign investors, but may be justified. I think the finance minister himself said that in an attempt to impose a buyback distribution tax, as I'm calling it, he's plugging a commonly used avoidance route. He's probably fair in doing that. I'm wondering whether he has overreached in any fashion and thrown the baby out with the bathwater, whereby legitimate transactions will now also have to bear the burden of that 20% tax.
In terms of intent to plug a loophole, I don't think you can fault him.
Yeah.
But there are going to be consequences. And there are going to be consequences which will weigh heavily in certain instances on a legitimate scheme to get minority out, through this route. There will be unintended consequences in terms of double taxation. So for example, let us say in a closely held company, I bought a share at 10, I sold it to you at 25. You are now the holder. and the buyback comes at this point in time. I have already paid on my 15% of capital gain. This will get taxed again.
Right.
So there is a series of issues, which will still come through, where there will be some adverse impact even on your local holders. But given the larger intent in terms of saying, look, here is something which was being used in a manner to denude our tax opportunity, I think you can't fault him. But there are a series of issues which will practically impact people, and those need to be properly dealt with.
I'll give you an example of stock options, for example. You take an unlisted company, Indian unlisted company, which has given stock options to its employees. Let's assume that the price at which the options can be exercised, for argument's sake, is 100 rupees, and the fair market value is 500 rupees. So on 400 rupees, you are already paying tax when you exercise the option as a perquisite. Now when the company buys back the shares, because in an unlisted company, the company buys back the shares. When you buy back the share at 500 rupees, again the difference between 500 and 100, to my mind, will attract this 20% tax.
So again, you're bringing up another instance of double taxation, right?
Yeah. So these kind of issues, if they can be identified.
Yeah, so how do you fix this? I don't understand. You start caveating what transactions will not come under this buyback distribution tax? Do you make it a case-by-case situation?
No, you don't make it case-by-case, because if you leave it to individual discretion, it's too inefficient a system and it's too loaded in terms of somebody's personal preferences. But there is no harm in clarifying that here are instances in which we believe there will be double taxation, and his whole focus is the domestic player in this, in any case, pays is 20%. So I am trying to really address the foreign player who was getting a certain benefit. I have an unintended consequence on the domestic player. Here is what I am clarifying. So there is nothing which prevents him from stepping in to reinforce what conceptually seems to be a good thing to do.
Okay, we're hopeful. What about royalties? He's enhanced the rate on royalties payable. Now, I understand this is not going to yield him much revenue, simply because a lot of companies that pay royalty pay them to companies that are in countries where we have treaties where the royalty is capped at 15%, right? So this increased to 25%. What does it amount to? In
practical terms, probably not very much, because as you rightly said, with most of the countries where you're getting in technology, you have a treaty. Plus, there is the balance of your transfer pricing provisions also, which sort of comes into play, in terms of ensuring that there is an arm's length and an adequacy and a functionality criteria. So let me sort of say, while practically it wouldn't have yielded much, why did he go this route? And one unfair and probably mischievous view is that if you couple this with the TRC issue, then the situation is TRC is not sufficient. I now look at beneficial ownership. That beneficial ownership test you will not meet. The treaty protection goes. Now 25% is real.
For everybody, irrespective of what the treaty says.
So the situation is, if you sort of project it far enough to say he knows he's not getting enough revenue, then why? And if you marry up the two, as some people are doing, then it
But you're not.
He's addressed
one issue is gone.
He's addressed the issue.
It's off the table.
It's off the table. But, that could then have led to a pretty significant amount of revenue collection and quite a few issues.
I would think, Mr. Shroff, that what minority shareholders were unable to do in the recent past.
It's actually a governance, a tax response to a governance problem.
Isn't it? Because what minority shareholders have been unable to do in the last few months with regards to the big hikes in royalties.
And we know of many companies which have actually do this to pull out cash.
In a sense, disincentivized royalty payments out, right? Especially if they're to companies in tax havens or lower tax jurisdictions where we may not have treaty protection, and hence then the highest rate applicable, which is 25%. Have I got that correctly?
He didn't need to sort of step in as a knight for, they have other.
No, I don't think he did it for minority. I think every country in the world is looking at royalty as one component of profit.
Cash extraction strategy for sure.
So they're all looking at royalty as a profit shifting exercise, and they're all trying to find ways to get around it, right? Okay, so to me, cumulatively, all of this sent out a fairly negative message, in a speech that otherwise started by saying foreign investment is imperative.
I think there was an expectation that, that he will in some way deal with the Shom Committee report on Section 9 and this whole thing on indirect transfers, and I think many clients internationally were very disappointed that this had nothing on that. But there's one more issue which I think is troubling, and MNCs are waking up to this. Across the board in indirect taxes, customs, excise and service tax, at a threshold of an evasion of 50 lakhs of rupees, he's introduced a situation where offences will be cognizable and non-bailable. Now that is...
This applies to all taxpayers, not just foreign,
That's
domestic,
right,
foreign,
right,
everybody.
Right. And that is a real problem in terms of building investor confidence, because what has happened is, if you have targets which are not met, officers are under pressure and they have the instrumentality of arrest, then they have used it in the past. And they have used it against MNCs who they believe were most vulnerable. And they have seen the payback of that because, payments have been made overnight. You put that instrument back in their hands, because there was a Supreme Court judgment which protected this sort of thing, saying that if it's fiscal or tax, ultimately you can pay. Why therefore have arrest, and why life and liberty issues? They brought this back, and they brought this back with vigor. And at a 50 lakh threshold, there are many companies whose daily tax payment is in excess of 1 crore.
Right.
So if your situation is that at a 50 lakh threshold, there's a vulnerability to arrest, now this is no longer about on profits do I pay, I don't pay, etc. Now it is my expat MD, my expat CEO effectively has a risk, and it has played itself out in the past. So I think, between the larger statements, which you could not fault in terms of sentiment or analysis, but that compared with the detailing, a lot of the detailing actually widens the credibility gap, and that's a worry.
So final word, Mr. Shroff. Despite what the finance minister says, it still seems like this budget is being run by the bureaucrats who run the tax administration. Is that a fair way to sort of wrap this up?
I think that's a bit of an overstatement, but they've had a disproportionate influence. And I'm not just playing on words over here.
Well, however you want to put it, the finance minister started by wanting to attract more foreign investment to the country. I suspect Budget 2013 may have done quite the opposite. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me, and thank you very much for watching this special edition. We'll be back next week.